unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. Imagine this. A deadly pandemic breaks out across India. Politicians debate the role of religion and religious pilgrimages in spreading the virus. Migrants flee disease by abandoning the big cities where they've taken up residence in the tens of thousands. Measures announced by the government meant to allay citizens' fears end up stoking them instead. While this description might fit India's coronavirus dilemma in 2020, it also captures the realities of India in 1817, or even 1917. A new book by the economist Chinmay Tumbe, The Age of Pandemics, 1817 to 1920, How They Shaped India and the World, takes readers on a tour of 3 previous pandemics that ravaged India and highlights what we might learn from this past trauma. Chinmay is a professor at the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad and author of the fabulous 2018 book, India Moving, A History of Migration. I'm pleased to welcome him to the show for the very first time. Chinmay, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me over.
So, Chinmay, let's start with the question about the kind of motivation for the book. You know, you began before the first chapter with an exchange between you and your son in which he asks you kind of very innocently whether there have been pandemics in the past. Tell us about how this conversation kind of moved you to put pen to paper.
Yeah, it's really strange, because if you asked me in January, that I'd have a book on pandemics by the end of the year, it was highly unlikely. And yet a series of events happened after that. And one of that was, my son asking me about past pandemics. And just the fact that the word pandemic was in his vocabulary at such a young age is, of course, striking. But then when I started talking about something like influenza, he said, I've heard this word influenza. He pulled out this tinted comic and pointed out the word influenza in one of these editions. And that got me really thinking as to how diseases are represented in popular culture, media, and so on over time. And then when he asked me specifically, tell me something about past pandemics, especially about India, I felt both happy and uneasy. Happy in the sense that I knew a little bit about it because I had actually collected a lot of statistics on the influenza even before COVID struck. I had a plan to write on the influenza, even before the WHO declared this as a pandemic. And also uneasy because I did not really know what to tell him, because there really is no book or no major account of what I call the age of pandemics of this period. And so that really got me thinking that maybe this book has to be written. And that's precisely what set up. The closest equivalent is David Arnold's book, which is an academic book on health, but that's 19th century. That covers cholera, plague, and smallpox. But the bulk of the action really happens in the 1900s and 1910s. And there's no influenza in that, which is really the biggest demographic disaster, which I argue ever took place in 2-3 months period, and in which India was the most affected. So all of this put together, told me that there's a book waiting to be written. And so I think since March, I've just been working nonstop on this book project, and I really wanted to get it out in 2020, and now I think the last month of the year I managed to get it
just in time. So just for a second before we move on, you had the idea of writing about the influenza even before the COVID-19 pandemic. What kind of moved you and kind of motivated you to think about that, even before this struck?
So this has been a long running sort of area of interest. I've never actually I've not written a paper or something on influenza. It started when I was doing my doctoral research back in the day on migration. And whenever I've done research on migration, when I've sat in libraries, archives, especially because I'm interested in the history of migration, you would often come across epidemics, because migration and epidemics, went hand in glove back in the day. But the influenza very specifically, in my doctoral thesis, actually, I'd collected the population growth rates of India at the district level from 1901 to now. And also have these maps, in my thesis. And the most stark map in that entire sort of series was the 1911 to 1921, where virtually all of India had negative population growth. And so that was a massive demographic shock. And I always looked at that map and said, look, there's much more waiting to be written on this particular decade, which had both the plague and the influenza. And so wherever I have gone, whether it was in the British Library, wherever it was in the National Archive, I always had this side antenna on saying that, if there's something on epidemics, pandemics, maybe I can collect. So, for example, at the British Library, I picked up a report on cholera, 1867, and so on. So they're all hanging in there in my folders. And then in the last 8 months, they kind of like got activated after years of lying out there. That's really how it happened. But the influenza part, I was really excited about. The plague and cholera is a lot of learning which has happened over the past 1 year. And for that, I had to look at a lot of mortality statistics, a bunch of other memoirs, records, a lot of the economic data. I think one of the things which medical historians have not done is really look at the economic fallout. And so my training in economics, I thought I should get this economic angle out there. So I think for all the three pandemics, I've kind of also, pointed out what was really the economic fallout.
So, one of the major revelations of your book is the fact that, in many ways, India was the epicenter of these three major pandemics, cholera, the plague, influenza, that stretched throughout the 19th and early part of the 20th century. And in this so-called age of pandemics, as you call it, over 40 million people in India lost their lives. And what's so interesting to me is, you write in your book that a lot of this history has been, quote unquote, wiped clean from people's collective memory. Given the scale of the devastation, why do you think this is?
Yeah, I think one part of it is, it did linger on in people's memories till about the 1950s. But as that generation died out, that intergenerational transmission was not there. And for collective memory to exist, you need books, you need memorialization, which has happened for the world wars, for example. Countless movies, countless books on the world wars. Even on the World War I in India, now you have a fair amount of literature and so on. So one, epidemics in general, I think the only pandemic in history which has been memorialized is the Black Death of the 14th century, which really entered European consciousness because that, devastated people. By some estimates, a third of Europe died and so on. So apart from that pandemic, infectious disease in history has not got the same sort of status according to it as compared to even famines, as compared to wars. They are the most sort of ghastly sort of events. So we know more about the 1876 Great Famine in India because that kind of led to political battles and so on. Infectious disease slips through the cracks. Why? Partly there's no clear enemy. So it's not like you're fighting the British or fighting a political state. It's coming from out of the blue. And second, also, this is a time where there are a lot of infectious diseases. So one way to look at it is that people themselves did not see this as something dramatically new because death rates were very high to begin with. But as I point out, death rates, even from that high base, death rates actually increased tremendously during this period. So the lack of memorialization, the freedom movement, interestingly, when we look at this period in Indian history, it's about the rise and fall of British rule. And yet, as I'm arguing, a common enemy for both Indians and the British was infectious disease. And if you look at day-to-day lives, I'm pretty sure more people are afraid of diseases than the British or the Indians fighting with each other. And as I pointed in the book, each of the pandemics were very closely tied with the freedom movement. For example, 1857 revolt and the cholera pandemic, the plague and the rise of the Congress, and 1918 and the rise of Gandhi later on. So it's very interesting that I think the focus on political history has meant not looking at history of science, medicine, and so on. And there's been no book. I think that's the fundamental reason. And that's one of the small sort of the sort of rationale for writing this was to start this conversation.
So let me ask you about cholera, which is the first of the three pandemics that you study. Now, cholera broke out in eastern India around 1817. In the late 19th century, the mortality from cholera was increasing in India, you point out, even as it was declining in many other parts of the world. I think Bengal had a death rate of around 3 per 1,000 people before 1920. Why was India in particular so badly affected by cholera?
Yeah, cholera is very interesting because the whole debate of that was on transmission, and we talk about that in a bit. But what the Europeans kind of understood very early on, and by early I mean 1850s, 1860s, is that cholera is essentially a waterborne disease. And this kind of changed the sort of weight of opinion. And so they invested heavily in better sewage systems, better piping, water supplies and so on. And that drastically curtailed cholera fatality or even cholera incidence rates, in those parts. It was more of sort of a prevention rather than a cure kind of a thing, because the real cure, that is getting down case fatality rates, actually had to wait early 20th century. But they kind of figured out how to keep cholera at bay. In India, that investment in basic infrastructure of water supply systems did not take place. Where it did take place, like in Calcutta city, it had an immediate impact. Death rates in Calcutta started falling from when this was introduced in 1869, 1870. So the crux is, that the officials, the public health officials in India, strangely enough, did not believe that cholera was waterborne. And so there's this really fascinating debate or fight between two different sort of schools of thought of what the Indian medical schools, and these are mostly British officers, saying that cholera is not waterborne, it's from the environment. Whereas these guys out there saying, no, it's waterborne. So actually, while Britain did the correct thing of investing in better water systems, in India that never happened. They should have done it either ways. Even if it was not waterborne, they should have invested. But the fact that they did not really delayed that aspect. But there's another aspect, Milan, which is the late 19th century is really sort of dark part of climatic history in India. And so India, if you look at India's rainfall history from 1850s to now, the sort of worst years of rainfall were in the 1870s and the 1890s. So there's a real water scarcity situation in India. Food production had slowed down. So cholera kind of acted on the general nature of water scarcity, because when you have scarce water, people start moving to places, tanks get contaminated, and that's the classic recipe for more cholera. And so cholera rates actually increased in the late 19th century, just as they're going. And the two principal answers I would say is lack of investment in public health, which was happening in Europe and not in India. And other was like a nutrition crisis brought about by these two massive drought periods in Indian history.
Chinmay, I want to go back to something that you talked about, which was, this debate that broke out over the kind of long, arduous search for what it was that was the ultimate disease-causing agent. You discuss in the book, and I'm wondering if this is linked to the issue of water, that there were two competing schools of thought, right? What you call the Sanitarians and the Contagionists. What was this debate about, and kind of who ultimately prevailed?
Actually, something as fundamental as contagion, incredibly in medical history, is a very recent sort of idea. So today we take it for granted that diseases can pass across human beings and so on. But until the middle of the 19th century, the prevailing school of thought in medical systems in most parts of the world was that diseases are caused by what is known as miasma, or bad air. And so if corpses or bodies are left, or any flesh is left to rot, it's that impure air which leads to diseases. And it's a thought which kind of prevails until the late 19th, early 20th centuries for many diseases. So the Sanitarians were the guys who argued that environmental factors determine diseases, and diseases do not get transmitted across human beings. And it was very easy for guys in India to accept the theory, because cholera did a sort of display seasonality. So it wasn't in all months of the year, it was in certain months of the year. So there were a lot of theories that why is it in certain months of the year? There must be environmental factors. Whereas the Contagionists, on the other hand, said, it passed on from basically, so there's a transmission mechanism, but it was not very clear to them how it was transmitted. And both of them had, their own arguments. The Contagionists would point out that cholera would start in a new place only when a person with cholera came there. So it must be contagion. Whereas these guys would say, look, the doctors administering the cholera patients are not getting cholera. So that's the classic counter argument to the Contagionist position, saying there are two people, same room, but you're still not getting cholera in the doctor's case. And this was finally solved in a huge way by John Snow in UK, who pointed out that it's not just sort of airborne transmission, what he called as a fecal oral transmission system, where it's you're ingesting it in water systems, it's going into your body and it's coming out in the form of your stools, rice watery stools, what cholera was infamous for. And those stools, as it goes into the sewage system, it contaminates water system, and if you start drinking from the same system, that's how it comes back to you. So this was kind of proven in a very nice way by these people. Very interestingly, in India, one of the rare British officers who was convinced it's water and not air, he had a map very similar to John Snow, but he showed a caste level map of an Indian village, and he showed that there's on one side the upper caste and the other side the sort of low ranking caste. And it's only the upper caste in that particular village which got cholera because they had two contaminated wells. And because the segregation is so stark, these guys did not get it because they were not drinking water from the same wells. So even the arguments I found it very fascinating as to how they were trying to argue the validity of water transmission. But the guys in India were diehard sanitarians. They argued it was always the environment. And their guru was a German guy called, Max von Pettenkofer, who's this great sanitary sort of official and physician in Germany, who had done a lot for improving public health system in Germany. But he was a diehard sanitarian, and he used to look down upon people who talked about contagion. Most famously, he ingested the cholera vibrio to show that nothing happens to me. It is all about the environment. And the Indian guys believed that school of thought for a long time. And unfortunately, they were completely wrong, with huge consequences for those 30 years. So just as it was going down elsewhere, it was actually going up. And what it tells you for in the context of any pandemic is that more than vaccination, understanding transmission is key. You see, most pandemics or most infectious diseases, the key is to understand transmission. Yes, vaccination can help at a certain point, but if you don't understand transmission, that's it. We've seen that with cholera; it lingered for decades, and even for plague. First decade of plague, people were just clueless about how plague was transmitted. So this transmission debate was a huge part of the cholera, circuit in the 19th century, and ultimately the Contagionists won. But what's interesting is what we now know about cholera, with modern day research, actually confirms some of the things that the sanitarians are saying. So we now know that cholera is not entirely waterborne. It can actually go from some other thing. So we say fundamentally waterborne, but it can have certain other transmission. They're showing that it is actually partly based on environmental factors. So it's remarkable because after 100 years, some of the hypotheses of the first sort of positions are being kind of proved as well. Though on balance, one would have to say that the contagionists were much more right than the sanitarians.
Yeah, that's a nice segue, Chinmay, for what I wanted to ask you about. There's several times when I was reading your book when there's this kind of uncanny resemblance between debates that were going on, hundreds of years ago and challenges the world is confronting today. For instance, during the cholera pandemic, you describe a debate that broke out over the role that religion and religious pilgrimages might have played as acting as a conduit for the disease. Of course, our listeners will be aware that in the early days of the coronavirus, a similar argument broke out, centered on this Islamic gathering that took place in Delhi, which was seen as a kind of super spreader event. It led to lots of communal kind of overtones of discussing COVID and so on and so forth. Tell us about what the controversy was about back then.
Yeah, so the idea was again about how is cholera transmitted, and one of the big theories was that cholera went from India outside to the rest of the world through pilgrimage routes. So it transmitted within India through pilgrim routes, and it got transmitted outside India also through. So in a way, the villain for the British was the Hindu pilgrim within India and the Muslim pilgrim going to Mecca. Now, was it accurate in terms of the actual transmission? To a certain extent, yes. Clear sort of time series which show you, for example, the famous Kumbh Melas in India, coincided with large cholera outbreaks across North India. And there were certain practices. For example, this practice of taking water from the holy rivers and taking it to your, home places, and in fact sprinkling in your ponds there. Now, this was the classic recipe for fecal oral transmission. And so once this cholera had kind of activated from 1817, pilgrimages were actually deadly sites. It was also interesting because it was a point on which both the sanitarians and the contagious agreed. The sanitarians would say that these are dirty places, and so you get diseases. And the contagious say that there's water, and hence you're getting cholera. But the difference of opinion between the Indians and the British were, Indians said, obviously this is part of our culture, and you need to invest in better public health facilities, better arrangements at our pilgrim sites, rather than doing nothing. Whereas the British just sort of cited Oriental fatalism and other factors saying this will never change. But what it did was, just like we have the Chinese wet markets today as a sort of point of all blame, it was the Indian pilgrim sites which became this massive sort of point of blame back then. So much so that there were these conferences, international conferences. In fact, the intellectual precursors to the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization, really its origin is 1948, but its actual origin, if you trace out how it started, is 1851. And they actually met to understand cholera in the world. And so these conferences always looked at pilgrims in a very negative light. And you had quarantines, you had vaccination programs for pilgrims. But in this, of course, there was a lot of victimization of the pilgrim as well, which is also what we see today. So to some extent, these transmissions, it is true that these transmissions, the pilgrimage routes did transmit cholera to a certain extent. but the response was outsized. They were the officials were never really listening to what the pilgrims themselves wanted. The worst parts of the quarantines were actually in the Middle East. So if you had to go to Mecca, there's an island called El Tor. In fact, the new cholera variety nowadays is actually named after that quarantine station. It's called the El Tor cholera variety. And this was a landing station for all pilgrims to go to Mecca. So it kind of reframed commercial relations. It kind of reframed trading relations between countries. And the sort of sole villain was this pilgrim. So this pilgrim became this huge outside. And the fact is, it was not just the pilgrims. In fact, one of the huge transmitters of cholera within India was the British military. And that was never sort of picked up widely enough by the British.
So, I want to ask you a little bit about the plague, which was the second pandemic you studied. Some of the numbers that you quote are just kind of mind-boggling. Bombay had a case fatality rate of over 70%, half of the city's population, around 400,000 people or so, at one point or another left the city in the late 1800s. You write that the plague claimed about 12 million lives on the subcontinent between 1896 and 1918. The year 1907 saw 1 million deaths in just that 1 year alone. What was very interesting, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, I want to ask you if you could kind of dig a little deeper. You mentioned that the plague played a crucial role in political movements in India of that time. It threw the spotlight on new leaders. It helped to build a kind of sense of organizational capacity, created a sense of solidarity through kind of volunteering and coming together. How exactly would you relate the awful things which happened as part of the plague with the kind of development and evolution of Congress Party politics at that time and the kind of evolution of the freedom movement?
Yeah, I think hugely. And, there's a historian, Ian Catanack, who kind of documents some of these aspects. But let me just touch upon some of them, and especially what, I found. We can talk of peak plague. Peak plague is 1896 to 1918, so about 20 odd years. Huge role to play. A lot of the Congress leaders really, started off in the anti-plague movements. Gandhi himself was an anti-plague movement, both in Gujarat and in South Africa later on, where plague also struck. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel was from Ahmedabad. His first sort of big role in life was as the sanitation sort of committee person in Ahmedabad municipality fighting plague. You had Tilak in Maharashtra. That this is a well-known incident. Tilak is sent to jail because of his, voice sort of anti official stance during the harsh plague sort of containment measures. And when he's released from jail, he's a national hero. There's Gokhale, who's a moderate Congress, who also becomes the staunch champion of plague relief committees. So just a wide range of some of the stalwarts of the Indian sort of Congress are in there. But I talk of 1 year, 1907, which is less known in Indian history. This is in a way the year where the Congress splits, and the backdrop of that is those million deaths, right? And there's a lot of sort of turmoil in Punjab, especially where plague was, hugely plague had kind of devastated Punjab, about how should one sort of look at plague and how should one be countering the British. And one thought said the plague is kind of God-given and there's not much the British can do. And the other saying this is completely a sort of British-driven problem. And this also became sort of reflected in the politics. So many things happened in 1907. There was also a bad sort of crop, but plague had a huge part to play in the setting the backdrop of sort of turmoil and eventually a famous split in the Congress party. But that entire decade was very eventful. The other part, which you mentioned, is a cooperative movement. Even today, some cooperatives in India are very successful, like Amul for milk and so on. But the cooperative movement almost started out in the backdrop of the plague. And what you really need for a good cooperative movement is leadership in organizing people. And that's what plague did. And one particular way in which plague sort of developed organizational capability was that after a lot of trial and error, they realized the best strategy to minimize deaths is to evacuate. And so, there were these mass evacuations. So whenever plague would come, it was again seasonal. There were, I estimate at least 30 million people must have evacuated at some time or the other. And you have memoirs, a lot of, first-hand accounts of this. Basically, the minute these rats came out from their holes, scurrying and falling dead, entire villages would depopulate and basically encamp outside the village or outside small towns as well. And that required organizational capability. So many of these guys in the cooperative movement, many of these guys in the political movement, like Gokhale, for example, they started off in plague relief measures. So it was that big of an organizational event, which of course, affected economic activity. There's no doubt about it. But what I'd like to highlight is to sort of start a nascent political movement, you need that leadership capability of organizing people. And this is, I think, the plague sort of set the backdrop for this to happen in a quite a spectacular fashion.
Just to stick with this period for a second, it was Lord Elgin, you point out, who was at the time the viceroy, who first enacted the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897, which is a law that still remains sort of on the books. It's funny, we often talk about kind of colonial era legislation. The police are still governed by the Police Act of 1861 until recently. Of course, the Land Acquisition Act was that act of 1894. What is the relevance of the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897 in the year 2020?
The fact that India is handling the COVID pandemic using literally the same act. There was one amendment this year, and that amendment was because a lot of people were attacking doctors. So they increased the penalties if you attack doctors. So that's one change which happened.
Physically attack doctors.
Physically attack doctors, yeah. So that's one change which happened. They had to pass in an amendment this year. But the structure is pretty much the same. There have been some amendments over time. And it's very useful for a sort of, a state which really wants to impose its will very quickly. It's a great law. It's a draconian law in the sense, it curtails everything possible. Now, an epidemiologist might say that, this is necessary. This is how you enforce lockdowns. But back then, this was a complete disaster. They enacted this law, they implemented it, and within a few months, they had to leave it. So though they devised the law, they never went fully with the law because they realized very quickly it had backfired. Because the more you put pressure to kind of curtail liberties, the more people, countered it. But this is a big, issue in public policy. How do you get people to kind of change behavior quickly in a pandemic without, going like what the British did? Because what the British did when the plague arrived was, the counter reaction was crazy. There was an assassination in Pune. These guys killed off Walter Rand was assassinated because these plague containment measures were seen to be very harsh, and all of them under the blanket cover of the Epidemic Diseases Act. So that act came about in February 1897. So the timeline is, plague really arrives in Bombay roughly September, October 1896, and they're clueless for a few months. And then as it's picking up, they take this decision, what, let's just do this. And then, it's literally a hurriedly cobbled law, which basically says, which gives you powers to shut down everything. You can do whatever you want. You can arrest whoever you want. You can have checkpoints anywhere you want. And that law is still there, today being used for COVID ban. And again, you saw the reaction against this, wherever the state tried to overreach very quickly, there was reaction even today, but not as powerful a reaction as we saw back then in terms of an anti-state kind of movement.
So coming to the third plague of influenza, what is commonly referred to as the Spanish flu, you note that, somewhere between 40 and 60% of the population contracted the virus, but there has been this lingering historical puzzle over the variation within India when it comes to death rates. So eastern and southern parts of India fared relatively better than western and northern. Typically, we have thought about this variation as something that has to do with, per capita income, with wealth. But you actually point to another factor, which is the presence of drought. Tell us about the connection between these things.
Yeah, so my theory on this is a drought-linked price rise linked, mortality impact. That is, people simply, so influenza acted on seriously malnourished bodies, and these bodies were malnourished because there was a severe drought in some parts of India. And that very neatly kind of explains the regional variation. And one way to understand it in terms of food prices, so food prices in Eastern India actually fell, whereas the inflation of food prices in Northern and Western India was 25 to 30%. So that's how dramatic price variations were within the country. And so my argument is more from the economic sort of sense that, or you can say, what Amartya Sen talked about famines, that often it is just lack of access because of, say, artificial scarcities, which drove that. The other contending theories, Ian I.D. Mills had a theory on climate, saying that it was colder up north. And so, because influenza sort of created pneumonic conditions, so a lot of pneumonia cases developed. So that was a climatic sort of argument. There's one argument of access to health facilities. But what I show in that chapter, if you look at the Indian army, which was reasonably well fed, or the European army, which was reasonably well fed, there is no regional variation. right? So whether you look at North, South, Eastern India, they all got kind of influenza, and case fatality rates were pretty much the same across the board. It's only in the non-cantonment region, which is the general population, where access to food is highly variable, that you got this regional variation in mortality. So my argument is hinging on the drought. And now, when we say drought, we often think in India that there's a drought every 5 years. So I want to talk about the intensity. The three worst droughts in Indian history were in 1877, 1899, and 1918. So climatically, this was a completely abnormal year. And the drought happened in June, July, August, and by September you could see the problems of the drought coming. And it's in September, mid-September, that the second wave of the influenza virus, the killer wave, really unleashes itself. And I have a very nice, a snippet from a memoir which is translated by Shanta Gokhale, by a lady called Lakshmibai Tilak, who kept an account. It's called Smriti Chitre, her account. Uh, to the best of my knowledge, nobody has looked at that book as a store of first-hand account of influenza, because the word used for influenza is manmodi, which is a local sort of language. So I don't think the translator of the book also knew that what they were describing in the book was influenza. But manmodi was used for influenza back then, and it's a gripping three-page sort of account in that book, which tells you very clearly the sequence of events. First, the drought, people were literally starving, and then came influenza and kind of just demolished sort of a lot of families. So this seems to be a more viable theory as to why so many people died in India, and virtually nobody was really affected in Assam, for example, in eastern India, but it really hit large parts of western and northern India. But that's a huge number, and my estimates actually are now taking the overall estimate higher than what previously people estimated, because I've also looked at the princely states. Previous studies looked at only British India. But one of the things I'm finding is that actually in Rajasthan or Rajputana and Nizam ruled Hyderabad, mortality rates were actually much higher. And so you found that when you add up those deaths, that number pushes it from roughly 15 million, what people are saying earlier, to about 20 million, which is huge because the overall influenza mortality is now pegged at about 40 million. We're saying about half of all deaths was in India. And again, I'd just like to point out there have been books on influenza, global histories, where India gets 2-3 lines. Or John Barry's best-selling book on influenza, India has one paragraph. What I find very interesting on even cholera, not so much on plague, but cholera and influenza, a lot has been written in the English language, in Europe, in US, but literally, a paragraph or two on India. And yet, India was the epicenter in all three of these sort of pandemics. So that's the kind of imbalance this book is trying to.
Obviously, the book kind of ends with telling us about kind of what are some of the lessons from these past pandemics for how we can think about, the COVID era. And you make the point in that concluding chapter that, look, democratic governance is ultimately very important for both government responsiveness and political accountability. And that the politics of pandemics, when you get down to, the nuts and bolts, is really kind of revolves around showcasing success. And I wonder, if you could reflect on this lesson for India circa 2020. Of course, one of the arguments that many commentators have made is that, look, there's actually a delinking of performance on the one hand in terms of how the government has handled the pandemic and the economic crisis and the humanitarian crisis around it, and accountability. Would you go so far as to say that, this is a genuine puzzle?
I think it's a very interesting puzzle. I'm not a political scientist, and so I'm always careful to make any comment on this. But my sense is the communication of success in India, whether it's on economic growth or pandemic management, the communication, or you can call it marketing, campaigning, whatever you want, has been very good this year. So a lot of people think that these were the best decisions taken. Many people think India is one of the best performing countries in the world on these facts. And it is, of course, true that compared to our own past history in India, they're not 20 million deaths, thankfully. And early actions were taken. The Prime Minister of India did trust science for the most part, unlike, say, the Brazilian premier and so on. So there were good things done. But if you see the numbers, of course, India lags low on both deaths per million and economic growth rates. So even compared to South Asian countries, India is really not looking. India is probably the worst performing South Asian. So what you're alluding to is, if, for example, there is no political backlash, is there a delinking between the pandemic and this? I think it's very varied, and I think the sort of ruling party is very sort of smart to also project that some of the sort of major issues which cropped up, for example, the migration crisis, the central government had nothing to do with it. So it was a state government. So a lot of the responsibility of the crisis has been sort of passed on to the state governments. So, for example, if you're asking about the specific Bihar sort of election, which is most recent and which the BJP did very well in right now, it is a big surprise to me, right? Because you'd had this massive migration crisis. You'd have thought that there's some backlash. But clearly, this was not high on the people's priority. And my sense is that, on the one hand, there's been good communication from the ruling party's end about what's been done for the pandemic, but also sort of passing on the blame that some of this migration crisis was beyond our hands. It was, part of the state government's hand. That's one way to look at it. But I think we'll have to wait for a few more elections to make some sense of what people are thinking about, or whether is this delinking between performance and this. On the other hand, the opposition, I don't think, has gone out forcefully saying a lot of this, or India is standing very poor compared to our neighboring countries in both the economic fallout and the pandemic fallout. So it's a bit of both, probably.
So, this is a nice note to end on, because it's a bridge between your previous work on internal migration and your new work on pandemics. And, few people I know have studied internal migration in India in greater detail than you have. In the conclusion of your new book, you note that, this flight of internal migrants is a kind of stylized fact that gets repeated throughout the age of pandemics. And so it occurs to me, as we think about the migrant crisis from earlier this year, which I'm sure you watch very closely, why do you think, irrespective of who gets the blame or not, put that to one side, why do you think it was missed, or perhaps not anticipated by the government in advance of the COVID lockdown, right?
Yeah, it's really beyond my sort of thinking as to how this was not anticipated. Especially the lockdown speech, it ought to have had something for migrants. If you're going to shut down the Indian railways with a 4 hours notice period, this should have been in the overall planning process. Maybe this lack of knowledge about past pandemics was a handicap. Maybe people thought that this is first time. Let's try it out. Maybe there was a thinking that in past pandemics it spread precisely because people went back, and hence let's not allow them to go back. But either ways, I'll tell you why I was surprised. There was a report in 2016 which told you the scale of circular migrants. There was a working group report on migration in 2017 which argued for portable social security, that migrants actually cannot live in cities for too long without some basic formal income support. So it's a puzzle as to why this was done. In fact, we had more planning in shutting down our airspace internationally. There was at least a few weeks of planning for that vis-a-vis our internal thing. And what I'm arguing in the book is, it's easy to, obviously there has to be some curtailment of movement. I think that's a no-brainer. But the question is about how and when and how do you sequence it. And international mobility is easy to shut down. You just shut down your airports. That's it. You can't come. But you can't do that with internal mobility. You can't just shut down the trains and expect people not to move. People will walk. And they did that. They did that 100 years back, and they did that this year. So it's purely from a feasibility perspective that having a strong shutdown saying you stay where you are for a few weeks is just not good. What really failed this year was no credibility in the timeline, right? Because it started off with 3 weeks. Some people said, okay, we'll stay here for 3 weeks. The minute it started saying one more week, that's when the crisis really intensified. So I think the learning from this is, whatever decision you're going to take, the biggest fallout of the lockdown is going to be on migrant workers. And Indian migrant workers are highly circular in nature. That is, they keep one foot in both sides. There's also a psychological dimension. That is, if there's a crisis, the first reaction is to go home. And as it's been documented in this pandemic a lot. But even during the plague, the voices on the railway stations back then in the 1890s was, if you want to die, might as well die back home. And it's a very, very strong psychological, cultural sort of imperative to go back home. So I think hopefully the lessons have been learned in a very stark manner this time around. And hopefully there's better documentation. One of the things I'm also arguing in this book is we need to have some sort of a commission on this whole COVID pandemic. For all their faults, the British, after every event, they would have a report. They didn't do it for the influenza very smartly because that was really a truly big disaster. But for cholera, they had annual reports. And over time, they helped. That incremental knowledge kind of helped them understand cholera and plague much better. And so hopefully, something of that sort.
Well, those of us in the United States believe that we need one of those after-action reports as well. Let me just ask you, one final thing on the migrant issue. What is your sense? We know there has been this big movement out of cities like Bombay, Delhi, where people have gone back to their homes. And there is a big concern right now about, if a large percentage of them stay behind, what is that going to do for the economic recovery? What is that going to do for dynamism, the restarting of industry and urban centers and so on and so forth? What's your sense about the timeline? Do you think that that migrants that you've studied are looking to go back to cities, or do they still not have the sense of certainty of social security, of kind of safety that they're going to be looked after if they do in fact return to the big city?
I think the first, that is, most will actually return. Most are looking forward to return for the simple reason. The first reason that why they came to the city in the first place hasn't vanished. That is, they're getting much higher wages than what they would get back home. And so, I think if you ask me now in December, what's the position? A lot of migrant labor has come back to Indian cities. There will obviously be a few people who've been frustrated by the whole experience of earlier in this year. And some surveys are showing some amount of reluctance, but it's a small number. So as a percentage, it's a small number who make up their minds never to go back to the cruel city again. But I think for most people, it's a hard economic reality, and they'll come back. And that's why what we need to do at the city's end is that the employers, basically, or the government, has to pick up the tab to ensure, safety in the case of the COVID pandemic, health checkups, tests. Testing is probably the most important thing to do, so that it's an incentive for actually people to come back faster. Because I think a lot of construction projects are still stalled because of lack of uncertainty about when will the lockdown in some parts of India be lifted and so on. So that should be done. If that's done, I think workers will come. So I don't see this as a permanent sort of impact, or that it will stop mobility. What might change is, of course, that the new destinations might emerge. So if you look at past shocks to migration corridors, often migrants choose a new destination. They say, Delhi treated me very badly. I'll try out, Bangalore. I heard good stories about Bangalore. I'll try out that city. So you might see some switching of migration corridors rather than a full stop.
My guest on the podcast today is the economist Chinmay Tumbe. He is the author of the brand new book, The Age of Pandemics, 1817 to 1920, How They Shaped India and the World. It's a tour de force of 3 previous pandemics and what they can inform us about India's challenge with the coronavirus. Chinmay, thanks so much for coming out. Congrats on the new book. And I think you could not have asked, unfortunately or fortunately, for better timing with the release of your book. We wish you all the best.
Thank you so much.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com, India's fastest-growing podcasting producing platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Jonathan Kay. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Maya Krishna Rogers is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production, brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.